A car come in with a crank no start condition. We did a fuel pump test by hooking up a fuel pressure tester to the fuel rail. We cranked the engine over and it showed about 5 psi. We then moved the lever on the return hose and fuel drizzled out. After further diagnosis, we found that the fuel pump was faulty. We started by disconnecting the battery, by disconnecting the negative terminal before we start working on the fuel pump. Next, I removed the strap that goes onto the bracket that secures the fuel tank into position. We then use this lift adapter on our transmission jack that's for fuel tanks to be positioned underneath the fuel tank assembly, and we remove the strap in the back that holds the fuel tank up in place. After both straps have been loosened and removed, the fuel tank adapter is now resting on the lift support along with the bracket. The bracket is attached by 4 bolts going through the frame. We removed the 3 bottom bolts with the impact wrench, and then we removed the top bolt with the ratchet and socket due to clearance and the brake cable assembly in the way. After removing those 4 nuts, we slid the bracket back as the fuel tank now is resting securely on the lift support with the fuel tank adapter. We then slid the fuel tank adapter lift support to the side and then slid the bracket out of the way so then we can lower the lift slightly down to get access to the fuel filler tube and remove the 2 hoses attached to the fuel filler tube. After we loosened those clamps and pulled back on the fuel tank to get access to those fuel filler tubes, there is an emissions hose that we needed to disconnect going to the charcoal canister. Next, we disconnected the electrical fuel pump sending unit electrical wires with the ground strap attached to the frame. After removing these electrical wires and ground strap, we then lowered the tank a little bit more to gain access to the fuel lines. 2 combination wrenches were used to remove the fuel supply and return lines going from the fuel tank to the fuel rail of this particular vehicle. These 2 nuts that screw into the fuel tank is then loosened and we lower the tank down to the ground so that we can get access to the fuel pump. Because of all of the dirt and mud underneath this particular vehicle, we cleaned the dirt and mud off of the tank because we didn't want any of those contaminants to drop into the tank when we removed the locking ring of this fuel pump. To remove this locking ring, we used a hammer and a punch to push on the locking ring to get access to the fuel pump. You can see there's some epoxy that was installed on this fuel pump assembly, and we clean all that off with air so that it doesn't drop down into the fuel tank as well. We gently lift the fuel pump out of the tank. This fuel pump assembly has a sending unit, fuel pump, and we gently pull this out with the fuel strainer, and we want to compare this fuel pump with the strainer and sending unit assembly to the new pump. So we're going to compare both of these, make sure that they both look alike, the connectors are the same, the hookups are the same for the fuel lines, and the plugs are also the same. We're going to install a new O-ring. We're going to position this very carefully so it doesn't drop down into the fuel tank, along with checking the new locking ring to make sure it will work. If it doesn't work, we'd have to use the old locking ring instead. The fuel pump, we're going to tip it slightly and angle it down in so that the sending unit doesn't get damaged, which is that float assembly, and the sock doesn't get torn as we lower the fuel pump assembly into place. Next, I'm sliding this locking ring over the fuel lines and hose to then bring it down to position it on top of the fuel pump to seal the tank with this O-ring and the pump assembly. So again, checking that O-ring to make sure that it's set into place correctly. And then we're going to take the wire harness and feed it up through the locking ring so that we don't pinch these wires or any hoses or anything on this fuel pump assembly itself. After we line up the grooves on the fuel tank assembly, we're going to hammer with a punch, just like we used to remove that fuel tank assembly. We're going to use a hammer and punch to twist the new lock ring back into place to seal it up against the tank. And we don't want to have any admissions codes related to the evap system. There's a little locking tab that you can see that I point out here as this is rotated and it goes right up against that piece right there. So then that way it seals on that tank. So we want to double check that everything's tight, make sure we don't have any pinched hoses or lines. Next, we're going to put the fuel tank assembly back over underneath the truck, and we're going to tighten the wire that attaches to the ground to the frame, and we're going to plug in those electrical connectors for the sending unit and pump assembly. After we attach those electrical wires, I'm going to tighten the fuel tank lines that attach to the fuel supply and return hoses, and we thread these into place and then get them nice and tight with our combination wrenches to make sure that they seal correctly, because we don't want any fuel leaks once we start the vehicle up. So we want to get both of these lines tight. We want to also get the evap hose connected with that hose assembly to the evap canister. So then that way we, again, don't have any evaporative emission codes. And we have a little hose clamp here that attaches to that evap assembly charcoal canister that will then crimp into place with this little connector here so that it locks that hose down and we don't have any air escaping in or out of this fuel system. Next, we're going to lift the tank back up into place so that we can get those hoses lined up with the fuel filler neck, the fuel filler neck, where you add gas when we go to the gas station. Those fuel filler necks, hoses, there's a big hose, there's a small hose. We want to slide this fuel tank as close as we can to those hoses, push those hoses onto the fuel filler necks, and then we're going to tighten these hose clamps so that again, we don't have any evap emission system leaks. So it's very important we check the hose condition, and also we check to make sure that these hoses are sealed properly. Next, we're going to take the fuel tank bracket and slide it up underneath where those 4 bolts that was holding the fuel tank up into place. we're going to slide that bracket up underneath the tank and hook those bolts that go through with the bracket into the frame. And then we're going to tighten those nuts back into place to make sure that that fuel tank is sitting in the correct location. And we're going to tighten all those bracket bolts nice and tight. So then that way the bracket will hold the fuel tank assembly up in place. After we tighten those, we're going to tighten both straps into place and tighten the one that goes to the bracket and the one that is separate here in the back, and make sure that they're tight. You don't want to over tighten them, but you want them back to how tight they originally were. So then that way the fuel tank doesn't vibrate loose or the strap come loose with this bracket as you're driving down the road. So we want to make sure that those straps are held in place. After we've put the fuel tank and everything back into place, we're going to crank the engine over or turn the key on, and you can see the fuel pressure went up to about 55 psi. We started, it jumped to 60, now it's running. And with the vehicle running, you can see that the crank no start condition is now fixed and the engine's running, and we just replaced the fuel pump.